My goal is to build an intentional audience. And that is because of changes that are happening in the landscape of online media, online content, how content is produced and how we consume it. Right now, we are experiencing the beginning of the age of AI. And I'm sure that this will affect many areas of our lives in many ways that we can't predict yet. But when it comes to content, I'm definitely seeing some signs of what's coming on the horizon. The fact that AI systems are getting better and better at creating all kinds of content and potentially flooding the internet with generic AI slop could actually lead to a golden age for content creators. But how you create content and also how you consume content will make a huge difference to the quality of your life going forward. So let me explain my thinking here, and I'll make some bold predictions here, which obviously could be totally wrong. Most predictions are, but still, it's interesting to do these thought experiments. Right now, we're in a situation where you can ask ChatGPT or Claude or a similar chatbot to create content for you. And if it's written content, it's basically a matter of a minute or so of your time to get a fully formed generic blog post on basically any topic you want. And you'll kind of get what you expect, because what the model can do is it can basically take all of the content that exists or all the content it's been trained on, which tries to be representative of the content out there, and make kind of a generic mishmash. So if you go, hey, write me a blog post on with weight loss tips for this kind of person, or how to be productive as a freelancer or whatever, you basically get exactly what you would expect. You get the most generic. It's essentially a competently written but very unsurprising generic blog post or article. And other forms of media are experiencing this too. It's just like lagging slightly behind. So you can already create pretty much any image you can imagine, and it's pretty close to indistinguishable from the real thing. And then with video, it's still quite janky, and audio is also not quite as perfect yet, but it's only a matter of time, probably not that much time, before you can get the same thing across all media. So we could say, hey, make me a YouTube video on this topic for this audience, and it will create a generic competent video. What this means is that there is no reason anymore for a human being to spend time creating generic content. And honestly, what a relief. I think that these chatbots came in just in time. A change was dearly needed, because what was happening was the internet was already getting flooded with basically generic and useless content. It's just that a lot of human labor went into making that content. And honestly, that's a bit sad. But remember 2 to 3 years ago, before the chatbot craze, already lots of people were reporting that they were barely ever doing an online search anymore. You wouldn't search for stuff on Google anymore because, well, you type in a keyword and what would you find? You wouldn't find helpful answers to your question. You would find all this generic, lifeless, just made for keyword optimization, garbage content, basically. Except that back then, it took a human being many hours of work to create that generic content, whereas now you can just use a chatbot and make millions of generic content pieces in the time it takes a human to write a single generic content piece. And that means the space is going to get completely flooded with generic content. Like I said, I think this is good news because if nothing else, it relieves human beings from creating generic content. But apart from that, it might sound like bad news. I mean, what happens if the internet gets flooded with all this generic AI slop? Isn't that bad for us as content consumers? And I think actually no, but it depends on how you find your content. The less responsibility you take in curating your media diet, in curating where you get your media from and how you consume media, the worse off you'll be, the more you will suffer. That is already true. And I think the rise of generic AI content will just accelerate that. It will make it even more true. So what I mean is, if you spend lots of time just consuming content from an algorithmic feed, you're likely to have a very bad time, because the algorithms are all optimized to basically keep you as addicted as possible. And unfortunately, because of the negativity bias, negative things, drama, outrage, and so on are more engaging and more addictive than positive things. And also, things that give you dopamine hits are more engaging than, let's say, educational content. So if you're just sitting there swiping through a feed, then the best case scenario is that maybe you get lots of like cute puppy videos and stuff, because that activates certain, bits of your brainstem that keep you hanging around. But a much more common case is that it's just all kinds of outrage bait and bad news and lots of us versus them content. Ever notice how so much online content sorts people into opposing camps? It's the political left versus the political right. It's the real gamers versus the SJWs. It's the vegans against the carnivores. It's whatever, right? There's millions of versions of this where people are fractured into these groups and then like kind of flinging dirt at each other. It's because that's engaging, saying, look, they are the bad guys. They are the problem. They are destroying everything you hold dear. That is basically an endless source of engaging content. And of course, if you consume all of this content all the time, it means that your mind becomes a less and less pleasant place to live in because it's filled with all this negativity and all this hate and all this outrage. Plus, it puts you in a dopamine depleted state where you need the next hit in order to feel slightly alive. And it's the whole problem, right? And by the way, check out my Dopamine Nation video if you want to know what the whole problem is in more detail. With AI content, it's only going to get worse because the whole process is accelerated. What we have right now is we have social media apps that are trying to be as engaging and addictive as possible. And the work of creating all of the addictive content is crowdsourced to millions of human beings. But AI systems will be able to accelerate the content creation by many orders of magnitude, which means that testing, like the evolutionary process of getting to the more and more engaging thing, will be accelerated. And it really doesn't make sense for humans to be a bottleneck here. So pretty soon, the person who's just consuming algorithmic content will be consuming content mainly that is created by AI systems to begin with. And here's my prediction. I think what will emerge is something like a wealth gap. But it's a gap based on what your life quality is like and what your mental capabilities are like, what your worldview is like, based on whether you are someone who just consumes algorithmic slop or whether you are a deliberate consumer, whether you have essentially a strict information diet. There's always been lots of wonderful, amazing, inspiring content and excellent discourse on the internet. It's just that, like Sturgeon's law says, 90% of everything is shit, so you have to find the 10% that is good. And maybe with a flood of generic AI content coming in, that changes to 99% of everything is shit, but still, the absolute amount of amazing and positive stuff on the internet is still huge. It's just a matter of finding those sources and curating a private feed, a non-algorithmic feed of really good stuff. Now, I said that there might be a golden age for content creators, and that's because I think that when it's no longer any use for a human being to create generic and uninteresting and non-human, non-authentic content, maybe more people will start making real, authentic, interesting content. Like the only way you can compete against the onslaught of generic AI slop is to be more human, more real, more authentic, and also more original. So the absolute amount of really good content made by humans on the internet might actually increase. And if this kind of wealth gap thing happens that I was talking about, where some people become increasingly zombified because they're just in a feedback loop with accelerated algorithmic content that's just designed to hook into their brains. And on the other hand, we have a smaller group of deliberate content consumers who also, in a way, become something like an intellectual and lifestyle elite, right? These are people who have way better lives and way healthier minds than the slop consumers. Then as a content creator, you're also incentivized to start talking to those people. Now, don't get me wrong, there's always going to be an incentive to create slop for the masses, and there's always going to be money to be made there. So it's not that like that's going to stop. But I think the opportunity on the other side for real human content is actually going to grow. So much for my theory. Now, here is where it gets a little more personal. This is just about my own strategy and what I want to do. I definitely want to make more human, more authentic content, and I want to attract that minority of people who are deliberate content consumers, which is to say I want an audience of people who get my content because they deliberately choose to get my content, not because I'm gaming the system and manage to get my content in the automatic feed, which is not that hard to do. You know, you make some kind of an outrageous statement about a currently trending topic and you make content about that. You can get into that feed, you can get lots of eyeballs. But is that actually worth doing? I recently saw this video from James Smith who talks about why he stopped making content on his YouTube channel with almost 500,000 subscribers. And I'll link to it below. It's worth a watch, but the short version is that he realized that he got good at playing the content game, getting the eyeballs, getting lots of engagement, getting lots of subscribers, but they were basically a low quality audience. They were low quality leads. And ultimately, he's actually better off having a much smaller audience of higher quality people than having this huge audience of, as he calls them, bellends. This is also something that I've noticed with content that has gone viral that I made. Some of my most viewed content pieces were ones where people started fighting each other in the comments. And that is engagement. That makes the algorithm show it to more people. But is that useful for me to have more angry people on my comment section fighting each other? And this, by the way, is also the reason why some of my most viewed videos I actually delisted. You can't find them anymore. What James was talking about also sounded very familiar to me. It's really about like lead quality, if you want to think of it in business terms, but also like the quality of the relationship you have with people in your audience. And it can be such a huge difference. So building a deliberate audience is what I want to focus on. And it's why my recent videos on this channel have not been, niche specific, branded, keyword targeted or anything like that. I'm just trying to make content that's as authentic as possible. And also, as like a very pragmatic example of this, it means that I want to have people on a mailing list. I want people to join my newsletter, and I want people to join my newsletter because they choose to. So that is why I don't want to present some super enticing lead generation offer. I don't want to go, hey, sign up for my newsletter and you get this amazing thing for free. Because then you get lots of people signing up to your newsletter that don't actually want to receive emails from you. So I'd rather have basically no offer at all. Sign up to my newsletter if you want to hear more from me, if you want to get emails from me. If I'm one of the people you decide you want to be part of your information diet, then get on my newsletter. And if not, don't. There's also a business case for this. And in my case, it looks like this. What I ultimately want to spend more time doing is I want to work with people in person in retreats and workshops. This is because that is one of the most enjoyable ways for me to work, and also where I have repeatedly seen that the biggest transformations happen. I can offer the most value to you when you're working with me in person. And think about it. If, let's say, the average multi-day retreat, let's say that costs $2,000, and let's say half of it is expense. So the average multi-day retreat makes me $1,000 per participant. If that's the case, just as very rough math, I basically need 1,000 people to make $1 million in profit. That's not that many people. And it means that I don't have to make something that gets millions of views. I don't have to have hundreds of thousands of people on my mailing list if that's my business model. In fact, it would serve me much better if I have, let's say, 1,000 new leads per year, and they are super, super targeted so that almost all of them are people who will eventually come to a retreat or a workshop that I host. And so as I'm making more content and as I'm trying to get into more and more conversations with my audience, I'm also trying to fine tune. Instead of trying to open the funnel and get more people in, I'm really trying to focus on how can I get better at identifying just the right person and then make content that serves that person. Make content that is maximally useful to that person instead of thinking, oh, what's the keyword that will get me 1 million views? In that sense, less really is more. And the question on my mind is, how do I go for this super, super high quality lead? Which in this case also, it means that it is someone who is a potential future retreat candidate, but also it means that it is someone for whom I can make the biggest difference. For me, that's the other side of the business equation. I want to attract the right people because doing coaching and doing retreats with people is super gratifying when I make a huge difference to someone's life. And I'm not so naive to think that I can do that for everyone. My target customer is not everyone. My ideal customer is the kind of person who falls into the kind of category of person who I can make a big difference for. And that's generally people who are very growth-minded, people who are ambitious, people who are usually quite headstrong, maybe overthinking tendencies, and people who are open-minded and who have the goal of living a really balanced life So it's not like a single pursuit of I just want to become super fit or I want to become super rich or whatever, but someone who's like, I actually want to thrive as a human being, like across multiple categories of life. How do I do this balancing act? That kind of person is someone I can make a huge difference for. And this ties back into the idea of not only being a creator who builds an intentional audience, but also being an intentional content consumer. Because in my opinion, that's one of the key things to do to thrive as a human being in these modern and increasingly noisy times. We are all confronted with the infinite flood of information and entertainment. And if we don't want to get lost in that, and if we don't want the negative aspects of all this attention optimized addictive stuff to affect our lives, having a really strict information diet and basically being a highly intentional consumer, that is one of the key skills. So if you haven't done that yet, or if you haven't done it lately, I highly recommend that you spend some time thinking about, what do I actually want from my content consumption? What do I want this to look like? And what would it look like if it was totally intentional? Like if it was 0% compulsive and random, just following the rabbit hole of the next recommended thing on the feed. An information diet that is good for me across the board is something I've been working on and cultivating for a long time. And let me just share with you some of my favorite ways of how to do that. The first is information sources. My main favorite information source is still, and has been for a long time, books. Books are great because they have so many of the opposite qualities of what makes bad content bad, in the sense that, what's so bad for us, what's so bad for mental health, is this kind of just swiping through all kinds of short form content that's just algorithmically optimized to like get us outraged and stuff, right? That's so bad for us. And everything is made to get our attention, and everything's made to spike your emotions, right? And books are just so the opposite of that. They're so unstimulating compared to, TikTok reels that you scroll through or something. And often a book is like someone's deep dive into the one thing that they're fascinated with, which is the total opposite of, next thing. So I find that books are basically like the opposite. It's like the mentally healthiest way to consume content is to spend time with a book. And one of my favorite ways to do that is to listen to audiobooks while walking out in nature. That is such a killer combination, and it's so calming compared to this kind of overconsumption. And of course, it's highly intentional because I have to decide which book do I purchase before that listening or reading experience even starts. But then let's also get to digital content. And one thing there is podcasts. Now, there's lots of podcasting apps you can use, but I think they will all have this feature, which is basically latest episodes. So there's podcasts I follow, and this is just a chronological list of what are the latest episodes they've published. I love this. This is great. It's non-algorithmic. I can choose which podcasts I want in this feed. And this is a great example of a feed that will often be interesting, but it never is this kind of thing that hypnotizes me and all of a sudden I've wasted 5 hours scrolling through this feed, right? That's just not how this works. Then another one is Substack. I've started reading on Substack quite a bit. Same thing. Obviously, they also have algorithmic stuff. It's kind of getting worse. I feel like they're trending towards algorithmic garbage on the homepage, but there's still the feed where you just get the latest articles from everyone you follow. This reminds me quite a bit, Substack reminds me quite a bit of like the old days of the blogosphere, where you just have people posting on their blogs and you're following these blogs and there's some conversation happening there as well. So this can be quite charming. And it's another example where it's just up to me to create the feed that I want. It's up to me to make sure that the stuff that shows up in my feed is the kind of stuff I want to see, and that it stays interesting, and that it's wholesome, that it's actually aligned with my real interests and not just pushing my buttons. I've also been using the Readwise Reader app for other online content that I want to kind of curate into my own feed. So anything that's not on Substack, anything that's on a different platform or a different blog or whatever that I want to have in one place. And Readwise also allows me to make highlights and save writing and so on. So that's the place where I kind of gather everything else. Then there is Twitter. I've gotten great mileage out of Twitter. The important thing here is there's the For You tab, which often contains a lot of garbage. very kind of aggressively bad stuff often, and a lot of templates. People will you'll see the same kind of headline and the same kind of formula used over and over again, because I guess certain things just get lots of views, and then people will use that over and over again. So I don't recommend the For You tab. I think that the way I see it, the For You tab and the Following tab are like two completely different apps. And the For You, whenever you hear people complain about Twitter, that's the app they're complaining about. They're complaining about the For You tab and how the algorithm is serving them stuff that is just good for no one and good for nothing. But the Following tab is a different story. This shows you a chronological order of posts by accounts you follow. And this has the same quality of, well, it's up to me to make sure that this is a good feed. And what I have found, and feel free to check out my Twitter profile and look at who I follow. Of course, I'm not saying you will love this content as well, but what I found is that the accounts I follow make for a feed that is generally positive and wholesome and highly interesting. There's many really smart people there that are sharing really interesting ideas. And also for me, one of the signs that this is a really good feed is I've gotten so many great book recommendations off of this feed. And then finally, of course, emails. There are some mailing lists that I'm a part of where, again, I'm very deliberate about it. I sign up for a mailing list if it's someone I want to learn from. And I use the unsubscribe feature liberally, right? I'll be on a mailing list and get an impression of, do I like this? Is this aligned with my life goals? And if not, I unsubscribe. I think this is great. This is what the unsubscribe feature is for, right? It's not a big dramatic thing. It's just if something doesn't fit into my life the way I'd like it to, it's not a good fit, I unsubscribe and it's all good. And that's also how I hope people use my newsletter. So this is in practice how I'm doing this. And in every case, of course, what this has in common is that I'm being proactive about creating my own feed. And instead of getting recommendations from an algorithm, I generally get my recommendations from other people. So I will ask people, what's your favorite book? Any great podcasts you've been listening to? And things like that. This means that overall, I'm getting my information from far fewer sources than if I was scrolling through an algorithmic feed, or at least I assume that's the case. But that's a good thing. It feels healthy. It feels like a slow and humane pace. Like I said, if you haven't done this yet, I highly recommend you give this a try. Really curate your own feeds. See how much you can calm down your sources of information, your information feeds, and how much you can get algorithms out of it. Because I think the life quality difference between being confronted with algorithmic feeds all the time and not is absolutely massive. So those are my thoughts on the future of content creation and being an intentional content consumer, as well as a creator for an intentional audience. If this sounds interesting to you, you might want to get on my newsletter. And if you're thinking, hold on, how can I know whether I want to be on your newsletter or not? Because I'm not telling you, what's the niche. I'm not going, I help freelancers make their first 5 figures in just 30 days. I don't have this clear elevator pitch niche statement, right? So how can you know whether you want to be on my mailing list or not? And for now, the only answer is, do you like this vibe? Because the truth is, I don't know exactly where this is going either. And what a relief that is. I'm actually glad that for once I don't feel locked into this is the path of my niche. Instead, I'm just following the creative flow. Now, I do have some ideas about how all of the stuff I'm interested in fits into a larger mission. And I'll be publishing maybe one really long, unhinged piece of content on this, or maybe a short series explaining this in greater detail. And if that sounds intriguing, get on my mailing list, see those content pieces, and then if you like them, stay on my mailing list. If you don't, unsubscribe. That's what I'd recommend you do. And in any case, if you find this enjoyable or if this sparks questions or ideas, I'd love to hear from you. And the YouTube comments are right now the best place to get that conversation going. So any questions, any feedback, please leave a comment. I try to read and reply to all of them. So that's all for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll maybe see you in the next one.